And get started. So welcome to the 8th webinar in our Carolina Canopy webinar series. Today's topic, the native plant paradox, the cost benefits of using native trees in the urban landscapes. Today's presenter is Dr. Stephen Frank with NC State University. Steve is a professor of entomology and an extension specialist there at NC State. His research focuses on the interaction of pests and abiotic stress on urban tree health and ecosystem services. Members of his lab also study invasive species and the benefits of diversifying urban landscapes with native and non-native plants. He has extension responsibilities across the state in IPM for greenhouse and nursery production of ornamental plants and urban landscape plants and trees. So with that, Steve, I will hand things over to you. Let me get you in as the presenter, and we can go from there.
All right.
You should be able to share your screen and get started.
All right, let's see. Is it up?
It is up. You just can go to the slideshow and you can get started.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect. That looks good.
All right. Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, everybody, for coming and sharing this webinar with me. Hopefully, you'll get something out of it. And I'll talk about today some of the research that we've done comparing native and exotic trees for use in urban landscapes, and some of the, as the title suggests, the costs and benefits of each. So in the lore of gardening and urban planting, native plants are often considered to be superior to exotics, to the extent that some municipalities, some gardeners, homeowners, and landscape companies will only plant natives and never plant exotics. And part of this, if you search the internet for native plant benefits, you'll find an amazing array of things that suggest native plants are adapted to local climate. Some folks say native plants are more resistant to pests, that they require less water and chemicals than exotic trees. I've even found information suggesting that native plants produce cleaner air and somehow save people money. And so, of course, a big one of these benefits that may actually have some reality is food and shelter for biodiversity, but we'll talk about that. So there's a lot of lore around native plants, and it hasn't always been rigorously tested. Let's see. There we go. And so one of the great benefits that's suggested, and if you talk to master gardeners and native plant enthusiasts, one of the, which I'm one, by the way, I love native plants as much as anybody. One of the benefits is that they provide food and shelter for biodiversity. And in particular, this has come from work and popular press books by Doug Tallamy and others that show that caterpillars are more abundant and more diverse in native trees than they are in exotic trees. And other herbivores too, they suggest, may be more abundant or diverse in native trees. And thus, to preserve that biodiversity, and more importantly to most people, is to preserve biodiversity and food for birds. And so by preserving herbivores in your landscape, most people consider the benefits of this to be as bird food. And then you'll have more birds and more hatchlings, and that's of course very great. However, as people who manage landscapes and trees, do we really want more herbivores? You know, this is kind of the paradox that that we set up when we started researching this is that, yes, herbivores are great as bird food, but they may not be so great in terms of tree management. And of course, this depends on your management goals. In some areas, some municipalities or arboreta or private gardens may be interested specifically in conserving biodiversity and can tolerate a certain amount of herbivores. Others, though, if you're managing trees in a city, the ecosystem services for people may be the most important goal, I would suggest, for those folks. And so we need trees to be healthy and to grow with little maintenance to provide atmospheric cooling, reduce pollution, provide shade, and of course, aesthetic value also. And unless trees are healthy and growing, they're not providing these services. So here's the paradox then. Herbivores can be pests, as some of the ones in this picture, cankerworms and eastern tent caterpillars and scale insects. But they are also part of what we generally call biodiversity. So we study urban trees primarily in my lab, and one of the things that we focus on is this phenomenon that urban trees tend to have more pests than forest trees. And so if you take any tree species and find it on a street and count the pests that are on that tree and the overall condition of that tree, it'll have more pests than if you go to a state park nearby and find the same species of tree. So comparing red oaks to red oaks or red maples to red maples or what have you, you generally find more pests on urban trees than on trees in forests. And one of the big questions we focus on in my lab is why? What accounts for this phenomenon? One of the big things that accounts for this that we've found is impervious surfaces. This is one of the primary differences between the environment in cities and the environment in forests is the amount of land that is paved. And this produces the urban heat island effect, where these paved surfaces absorb solar radiation and release that into the environment as heat. And it also creates water stress because, of course, these surfaces are impervious. That means they're impervious to water, and the soil below those surfaces tends to be drier and more compact than soil that's not below impervious surfaces. Okay, and so high temperatures, heat, can increase arthropod reproduction, growth rate, and winter survival, among other things. And water stress affects tree functions and quality. So tree functions being growth and photosynthesis, and all the processes that trees do to provide their services. And water stress also can affect arthropod growth and arthropod reproduction by changing the nutrient value of trees for pests. So these are two main things, both cause heat and water stress caused by impervious surfaces, that help account for greater pests on urban trees. So one of the pests that we've studied a lot is the gloomy scale, and as far back as 1912, a professor at NC State documented gloomy scale throughout the cities of North Carolina and called it the most important shade tree pest in the state. And so it still is, and we began studying this maybe 10 years ago. With the help of Adam Dale, who's now at University of Florida. He was a graduate student in my lab. And the way that we approach this is we use a thermal image of different cities throughout the East Coast primarily, and we can use these thermal images from satellites to document the hottest and coldest parts of cities. This is the city of Raleigh in the upper left. Actually, I think I have a pointer here. There we go, pointer. In the upper left, there is this big red blob, which is the Raleigh International Airport, and next to that is a state park. And you can see the difference in temperature there from red to blue. Uh-oh. Okay. And so the long and short of this, Adam studied this and we've studied this for many years, and I'll just get to the point that heat and drought combine to increase gloomy scale abundance and also how many babies they produce. And so trees that are about 2 degrees hotter have 300 more scales than trees even a block away that are cooler. And so this is a picture of gloomy scale embryos. Scales on those hotter trees produce 30% more eggs than scales, again, on trees just 2 degrees cooler. And that's a lot of scales. Same thing with oak lecanium scale, the other probably dominant scale in North Carolina and throughout the Southeast, and up into, with this one, up into the Midwest and Northeast also. And what we find is that, and this was Emily Meinecke's work, she's at UC Davis now, but she did her PhD on lecanium scale. And she found also that trees just 2 degrees cooler produced, 10 to 12 times more scales than trees nearby that were a little bit cooler. So that's kind of the baseline of how we got into this question, and wondered if this is happening on red maple and willow oak, the 2 most common native trees in a lot of southeastern cities. Is this also true of some of the exotic species that we plant? Both of these scales are native insects, and so we're not dealing with an invasive pest like emerald ash borer or something like that. So we've got native scales on native trees. The scales just go crazy in urban environments. So what we did first to address this was we simply compared scale density on some native and exotic trees, and we compared trees in the same genera so that we'd have sort of an apples to apples or maple to maple and oak to oak comparison. So we studied two native maples, red maple and sugar maple, and 2 exotic maples, Japanese maple and Norway maple, and 2 native oaks and 1 exotic oak. So we collected branches from dozens and dozens and dozens of trees throughout. This was primarily on the NC State campus and nearby streets. And the gist of this is that on our native species, Acer rubrum and Quercus alba, that's white oak, and even the willow oak Quercus fellows here, you have many, many more times of scaling sex. White oak has 106 scaling sex, and this is per 6 inches of twig. So 106 scales per 6 inches of twig on white oak, whereas on our exotic oak, this is sawtooth oak, you have almost, pretty close to 0.3 scales. Acer rubrum, 28 scales per 6 inches. Our 2 exotic maples, less than 1 scale each. Okay, we repeated this in 2016, mixed up the species a little bit, and found similar results where Acer rubrum had many, many more scales, 100 or really 1,000 times more scales than the two exotics. This time we had trident maple in the mix along with Japanese maple. And of course, Quercus alba and Quercus fellows, many more times scale than sawtooth oak. So, of course, the other question we're interested in this lab and people are interested in regarding native trees is what about biodiversity? And particularly in our lab, we're interested in biological control, and we're interested in how using certain tree species or combinations of plant species can reduce pests by supporting predators and parasitoids of pests. And so, in addition to collecting scales on these trees, we also collected natural enemies. And you can see some of those here. We've got these really pretty parasitoid wasps, excuse me, that are very tiny, along with some of the more common predators that you might find, like ladybugs and minute pirate bugs and spiders. Spiders actually are the most abundant predator in all of these trees. They're also great bird food, by the way. They're rich in calcium. Okay, so the essence of this, and the paper is here, and the paper is on our website if you want to see the nitty gritty. But it turns out that in addition to having hundreds or thousands of times less scale insects, our exotic trees supported similar natural enemy communities. And so similar in abundance of natural enemies and similar in the diversity of natural enemies that they supported. And so there really seems in this case to be a benefit to having some of the exotic trees with few pests that also support equal biodiversity. Now, all this work that I just described was on NC State campus, which, is less stressful for trees than some downtown or highly impervious areas. There's lots of tree cover on campus and less impervious surface relative to really urban areas. And so we wanted to combine our questions of native versus exotic trees and pests with the questions we've asked before about the consequences of impervious surface. So essentially the question came down, for tree health and maintenance, which is more important, what we plant or where we plant it? Okay, so here's a tree planted in kind of a park-like setting that seems to be doing very well. You can see red maples in the bottom images. This has got to be a 4x4 foot tree box, and these red maples along a parking lot are not doing well. So this work was done by Christy Bakke. She did a PhD in my lab recently. She's at University of Oregon now, or Oregon State Extension, pardon me. So she took 96 trees. She didn't take them, she used them for her research, 12 each of native and exotic maples. Okay, so trident maple and Norway maple versus sugar maple, and we used this Freeman maple, which is a hybrid of red maple and silver maple, both native species. We didn't want to use red maple again in this research because we kind of know the situation for red maple and didn't want to skew our results with a known outcome, since we know that those are so heavily infested with scales. So we went for this hybrid. And in oaks, there's really only one really common exotic oak, and then we had white oak, pin oak, and overcup oak. And so what makes this different from the previous work is that we picked all the trees along gradients of impervious surface where we had some trees in this very dense gray area here, surrounded almost 100% by impervious surface, some that were in the 30 to 60% impervious surface, and others that had very little impervious surface that were planted in yards or campuses or things like that. And so this allows us to address both the native exotic comparison and the impervious surface stress. Okay, here's some examples, a red maple in a yard and a red maple along a street. Some more examples of trees that we studied, different situations. Okay, and so we collected insects to assess biodiversity. We collected insects in this crazy funnel sampler that we made. This is my former student, Larry Long. And this looks like we dispatched the Tin Man and made scientific equipment out of him. This is just a funnel, and there's a wooden piece on top that claps up and down when you pull the string, and that knocks insects down into a collecting vial. So that's how we sampled biodiversity on these trees, by collecting insects in the funnel. We sampled scale insects by collecting twigs and counting, and we identified all these critters to their taxonomic family. Okay, the gist of this, on the x-axis we have our native and exotic species. Trident maple and Norway maple here are the exotics, of course. And what it turns out is that our native species, Acer freemani, has the most scale insects, and our two exotics have low scale insect density. This also held true for maple spider mites, another potential pest. It's a big pest in nurseries, actually. It sort of comes and goes from urban trees, but far more of those on the native species than on the exotic species. Okay, also other pests, including aphids and leafhoppers, followed the same pattern. Okay, so we of course also, I don't want to show you graph after graph after graph here. We saw similar results with the oak species that we studied, and we repeated this research for 2 or 3 years, and essentially it comes out the same, where pests became more abundant on native species than exotic species. But the big difference here is that pests became more abundant on native species as impervious surface increases. And so just as we saw in our early research with gloomy scales and lecanium scales, as impervious surface increases from 0 to 100%, pests also increase on those trees. The difference is that exotic trees, which have low pest abundance to begin with, maintained low pest abundance as impervious surface increased. And so these trees don't have the same response to the stress of impervious surface where they become more susceptible to pests. They stay equally unsusceptible no matter what conditions you plant them in. And so this is kind of an interesting finding and a potential benefit of using some exotic trees, particularly in the most impervious, high stress areas. Okay, so we all know the saying, put the right tree in the right place. And for this, we found in our work, this work and others, that natives are not always better. Now, lots of you already probably understand this, but natives are not always better, and natives do the best, it seems, in conditions that approximate their native situation or their native habitat. And so these are areas with less impervious surface and cooler temperatures. And so we should save natives for use in appropriate conditions where they can thrive. Since they are more susceptible to pests, we have to be considerate of that and use them in situations where they won't be so pest prone due to temperature and stress. So put these natives like red maple, which end up planted all over the place, save those for low stress conditions that approximate their native goals. And in that way, you may meet some of your conservation goals. Because remember, you can't meet conservation goals with a dead or dying tree. And so if it's native and it's in poor condition and the leaves are falling off and half the branches are dead, that's not really conserving very much biodiversity, and it looks awful and it's a hazard. So we have to temper our conservation goals with reality in that way. So exotics may be better in high stress conditions since they don't get many pests. These high stress conditions do not increase their pests because there aren't any to begin with. And so when you have pest prone sites with heat and drought, consider some exotic species for use in those. And in this way, the exotics can help you meet your management goals of tree growth and tree survival, and also the ecosystem services that they provide, because these trees will continue growing, continue their photosynthesis, which is responsible for transpirational cooling and shade and pollutant reduction that won't happen on trees that are under stress. And it turns out as gravy that these exotic trees also conserve a ton of arthropod diversity that's similar to natives. Okay, so the next question that we wanted to address in this native exotic debate is that most of the trees that we plant, particularly red maples, are not wild type trees, okay? And so the comparison that I made earlier between finding an urban tree, an urban red maple, and then going to the park and finding a forest red maple, the forest red maple is a wild type tree that evolved in that location, in that region, in those growing conditions, and has genetics that correspond to that evolution. Unfortunately, in cities, most of the trees we plant are cultivars, and these cultivars did not evolve to any particular condition. They're generally selected for fall color, growth form, growth rate, so that nurseries can produce them quickly, and growth rate is not always high growth rate may be good for nurseries. It's not always good for street trees. And so, and also many of the genetics of many of these cultivars are from the Northeast or from Ohio or from Oregon. And so they didn't evolve in the locations that we're putting them, and the genetics themselves are not ideal for planting at least in the Southeast where I work. So cultivars did not evolve anywhere. They're selected primarily for aesthetic traits. And we see, in crop plants and other systems where when you breed corn or wheat or something to increase yield, when you breed something for a specific trait, some other trait has to be lessened. We can't have super plants that are good at every single thing. And so when we breed crop plants for greater yield, they often become more susceptible to pests. When we breed trees for better fall color or faster growth rate, something has to give, and that could be their resistance to pests. So our cultivar is native. So we discussed before, heat and drought increase gloomy scale abundance and fecundity on red maples. And we talked about this research, and this research was all on street trees, which typically are cultivars. So we asked the question specifically whether red maple cultivars are more susceptible to pests than wild type red maples that have the local genetics. And so, well, this was supposed to be an animation, but in any case, we conducted a nursery experiment where we grew wild type trees and multiple cultivars of trees in containers, and infested them with gloomy scales and monitored them for a couple of years. And again, the punchline here is that there were 60 times more gloomy scales on the cultivars than on the wild type trees. And it didn't really matter which cultivar it was. All of the cultivars had more scales than the wild type. So we wanted to address this further in more real world conditions. And so we looked at Raleigh street trees and parking lot trees and what have you. And we counted scales on 30 wild type trees, 30 cultivars, and 30 of the Freeman maple hybrids. And, in the nursery experiment, we could select specific cultivars to work with. And so we used the most common, the common ones like October Glory and Red Sunset and those. On street trees, you can tell if a tree is a cultivar or a wild type, but you can't tell what cultivar. It's just impossible. There's too many cultivars. They're all very, very similar, and trees exhibit a lot of variation in form depending on their conditions. So anyways, we could compare red maple cultivars to wild type, but not specific cultivars in this situation. And the Freeman maples are easy to distinguish because they have large leaves that look like the silver maples that they're bred with. So we could distinguish those also. And we counted scales, and then we also considered their condition ratings. And these are condition ratings that are found in the city tree database and that we can also assess ourselves, that range from poor, fair, good to excellent condition based on form and canopy density and number of dead branches and things like that. You guys have probably all done that. Okay, so as an example, here's an excellent tree. Here's kind of a good to fair tree, and here is a poor tree, all from NC State's campus. Okay, so our scale abundance, first of all, is nearly 100% gloomy scales. And what we find is that the hybrid, the Freeman maple hybrids, had the most scales. This is a log scale, which goes up by order of magnitude. And so the hybrids had far more scales than the wild type, and the cultivars also had more scales than the wild type. So this matches what we saw in our nursery experiment, where we had more control over the situation. We corroborated those results on actual street trees that we were able to identify as wild type cultivar or hybrid. Okay, for our tree condition ratings, for wild type trees that we were able to find in Raleigh, 66% of those wild type trees were good or excellent. 23% were in fair condition and 10% were in poor condition. When we assess the cultivar conditions, 45% of those trees were in good or excellent condition. 34 were in fair condition. So we're already have fewer top quality trees, and we're creeping up in the lower categories. 21% of those trees were in poor condition. And with the hybrids, it's even worse, where very few of Freeman maple trees planted along streets are in good or excellent condition. And these are the fastest growing, most scale susceptible trees. So 13% in good or excellent, almost 70% in fair condition, and 20% in poor. And so in addition to the difference in scale abundance, and all through this research, if trees have more pests or more herbivores or more scales, but they still look good and they still survive and do what we want trees to do, then it doesn't matter so much. But in this case, the trees have more pests, but they also are in worse condition, both due to the pests and to the environmental stress that they're experiencing. So through this and other work that we've done, we've established that red maple cultivars and hybrids are more susceptible to scale insects and environmental stress than red maple wild type trees. So cultivars have more gloomy scales. Freeman maples have the most gloomy scales and are in the worst conditions. And wild type trees had almost no scales, surprisingly. So implications of this for management. In hot urban sites, consider using exotic trees with fewer pests. You can see a red maple here on our campus in poor condition, planted in a stressful location. It's covered in gloomy scales and is having a pretty hard time. So in some of those locations, parking lots and right along streets, exotic trees may perform better and have fewer pests. Consider wild type trees when they're aesthetically acceptable. Now, a lot of the decisions for which trees to plant, of course, are made by, on the design end, landscape architects and designers select trees based on qualities that that may be aesthetic or otherwise, and often you want a long boulevard of perfectly uniform bright red trees, or I'm not a designer, so I can't even think of what a good design would be, but you often want that uniformity and some striking characteristics like fall color in certain locations. And with wild type trees, you don't have the uniformity in growth habit. You don't have necessarily uniformity in fall color. They're all genetically different, and so some have greater color, some have less color. Their growth forms are different. These cultivars, it's important to consider, are all genetically identical within, and so if you have an October glory, that's genetically identical to every other October glory in the world. And so if that genotype is susceptible to a pest or susceptible to a particular kind of stress, then there's no genetic variation, just like in a field of corn where, they're all genetically identical. So one pest or disease can take out the whole bunch. So when it's aesthetically acceptable, and maybe this is in parks, and maybe it's in clover leaves along highways and things where maybe the design aspect is less critical, you can plant wild type trees, and they should do well and have fewer pests. And I think, the main thing, we all know that tree diversity is critical for sustaining urban canopy cover. I think most people are familiar with, Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer, where when cities have low tree diversity, one pest can take out a significant portion of the canopy. So, so cities, including Raleigh and others, are trying to increase tree diversity to make their canopies less susceptible to those invasions. And so we need to use every tree species at our disposal and try and avoid native-only ordinances or things that restrict the species of trees that we can use. Okay, so urban forest canopy tends to go in one direction, and unfortunately that's down. In this bottom figure is an aerial photograph of Queens, New York. Obviously, not much tree cover there. It's when this picture was taken, it was 9% canopy cover in Queens. And New York is a very, very old city, one of the oldest in the country. It's obviously very densely populated, and the tree cover there is very low. This is Raleigh, or it was 2 years ago when I retrieved this picture. At that point, Raleigh still had 50% canopy cover. And Raleigh's a smaller, younger city than New York or lots of places in the Northeast. But that canopy, tends to go down. Right outside of my house, as we speak, is a city crew taking down an 80-year-old willow oak this morning, and there's no tree beneath it, to come up in its place, and so there won't be another tree shading that street for 80 years at this point. So urban forest is declining. Sorry to end on a sad note here. This negatively affects vertebrate and invertebrate wildlife, and of course also negatively affects human health. And so we need to use all tree species to increase urban forest resilience. Okay, if you want more information on the work that we do, you can visit my lab website. It's just 6 letters, EcoIPM, ECOIPM.org. And you can find all of our scientific publications there. You can find information about the research we're doing. We have extension resources there if you want, fact sheets and things of that nature. And we have a blog there where we talk about trees and pests and that sort of thing. Lots of folks have contributed to all of this research, both hands-on and funding-wise. And so I'll stop there and take any questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Steve. So now we've got some time built into the agenda to answer some questions from all the attendees. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, you can post all of the questions in that question panel, and we'll get to them one by one as we go through. So we've got a few minutes here. I've got some questions that came in. I don't know if you can see them on your end, Steve, but I can read through them.
I cannot. If there's a way, let me see. Oh, let me see if that's chat questions.
But I can read through them
Okay.
and give you a chance to address each one. So
Okay.
the first question that came in asked if you're concerned about some exotics that are invasive. Most notably thus far in the presentation was Quercus acutissima. So that was the question there.
Okay, yeah. And so there are, we've focused on, the pest aspect of these exotic trees, and there are situations, in the Northeast. I'm from Maryland. I guess that's not really Northeast, but up there, Norway maples are problematic in some areas, and pear trees and things down here have become problematic. So there are problems associated with using exotic plants and importing exotic plants, and I probably should have mentioned this in the beginning so as not to minimize those. But the ecological and evolutionary question is similar in that, if we find exotic plants that are not prone to become invasive, which we can't always predict, then typically they would have fewer pests than native plants, because the native insects just have not evolved to feed on those species. So that is, obviously a concern using any exotic plants that are imported, and that falls sort of to, I guess, the regulators or screening those species before we use a widespread implementation.
Yeah, and I would say for anybody that's considering exotic plants to be planted in the landscape, there should be an invasive plant council or native plant council in most states that you can get a list of what's on the highly invasive list and maybe try to avoid those. But
Yeah.
So there are resources out there to make sure you're avoiding the invasive exotics. All right, so another question came in. It says, do you find support for controlling or for control of invasive exotic pests by planting non-natives as a mean for supporting exotic predators to control those pests?
Can we try that again?
Sure. Do you find support for control of invasive exotic pests by planting non-natives as a mean for supporting exotic predators to control those pests?
Okay, I think I got it. Let me break that in half. In terms of exotic pests, we find that, take emerald ash borer, for instance, is more harmful to our native ash trees than it is to exotic ash trees. And this is because, the ash trees from Asia, where emerald ash borer evolved with those trees have evolved defenses against emerald ash borer. Our ash trees that have never seen emerald ash borer have evolved no defenses, and so they are damaged and killed very quickly. And so in that way, the Asian species do offer some resistance to exotic pests. so that's the first half of the question, and we see similar things with other pests. So that's the first half. In terms of supporting exotic natural enemies of exotic pests, I don't think there's any evidence for that, and I'm not sure that anyone has actually asked that question. And so, thinking about emerald ash borer again, there are parasitoids that they've released to try and combat emerald ash borer, but I don't think that those, they haven't thrived very well so far, but I'm not sure that they would rely on any resources from the exotic ash trees. Did I get it?
Yes, you got it. Sorry, I forgot to unmute. The next question is, did street trees have more scales because they were in a bad condition, or the reverse?
Okay, so this, pardon me, this is kind of an ongoing question, but there's environmental stress on those trees even without pests, and that environmental stress benefits the pests. And so there is, they're interconnected. What we do know from doing laboratory experiments and doing experiments in our nursery where we can control the conditions, if we take trees that are in good condition and we subject them to stress, we can change their susceptibility to scale insects, before they deteriorate. And so they become very quickly more susceptible if we subject them to drought stress or high temperatures. And so, it's very hard out in the wilds of street trees to, we're just assessing what exists, or how things are now. But in our lab and nursery experiments, we have addressed that and find that trees become more susceptible even when they start in good condition. We have done research on street trees where my student Christy assessed. We tried to understand where in the life cycle of a tree they become infested, partly to get at this question. And so we used the tree database in Raleigh and studied, 2-year-old trees and 4-year-old trees and 6 and 8 and 10 and 12. And what we found is that, regardless of condition, scale abundance was very low on trees for the first 6 years. And somewhere between year 6 and year 8, we saw an exponential inflection, and scale abundance started going up and up. And so, in that sense also, we sort of addressed this where the trees are kind of going along fine until year 6 to 8. And then at that point, for some reason, the scale insects explode. Now, is that because, pardon me, is that because, after 6 or 8 years, the trees kind of reach their root capacity if they're next to a street or encounter, the stress affects them more? We don't know, but that's the timing of scale infestations in the life cycle of the tree.
Okay, great. Now the next question is from Natalie Garrett. Now you might have to chime in here to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. But her question is, does this count for landscape architecture credit and landscape contractor credits, or just one of the two? Which one, if so? I'm not sure what she's talking about there, but you might. I don't know.
I do not. I do not know the answer to that.
All right, so I'll wait for Natalie to maybe chime in again and clarify. just so we can make sure we get that question answered. But the next question on the list is, how available are wild type trees?
Okay, so wild type trees are not as available as you would hope. They are available though. There's, we found several nurseries in North Carolina that are producing these, a couple right around Raleigh. And these are nurseries that are geared towards native plants or restoration, restoration type nurseries. And so they are available, and ours were grown from seeds collected in the neighboring county. But they're much less available, obviously, than the cultivars are. But we did other experiments where we used wild type trees. We could find, we needed wild type trees from New York for one of our experiments, and we were able to find those, and wild type trees from Tennessee and other places. So they are available, but they are harder to find than the cultivars, which are produced, by every nursery everywhere.
All right. So the next one kind of tags onto that slightly. This is great outreach to bring awareness to the benefits of using native trees in our urban forests. Is there any outreach to nurseries to try to encourage them to grow more native species to make them more readily available?
Well, I talk, my extension responsibilities include nursery growers, and I talk to them about these same issues and same presentations. And so that's kind of the outreach that I do to the nurseries. But I think, there probably needs to be more. And if people are interested in wild type trees and people want to purchase wild type trees, then the nurseries will grow them. And I think the whole industry is a combination of what nurseries can produce profitably, what designers spec on the plans, and what landscapers and arborists install. So it would be nice to see more, but I think there first has to be a demand.
True, very true. All right, so next question is, Talamy's concept of how to create urban suburban ecosystems wrong, or how wrong?
I would never say that Doug Talamy is wrong. Doug is a very nice guy, and I enjoy his books also. I think that it's not that Talamy is wrong. I think it's that there's been an explosion in native plant enthusiasm, which I think is great, but that has led to some uninformed decisions about, for example, native only ordinances, and things like that. And Talamy is also a great scientist, and so the work that he writes about is, he's counted all those caterpillars, and he's measured those things, and so that's not wrong. That's legit science. But I think when you extrapolate that and say, well, we're only going to plant natives ever, there's not science behind that policy, right? There's science behind Talamy's ideas, but there's not science behind policies that say only this or only that.
Right. And I would add to that, just from my perspective, Steve, and you can tell me to be quiet. But
I would never.
A lot of the native species, native species groups are doing it for, the benefits that they provide, for example, wildlife or overall biodiversity. So you've got to think about where those trees are, what their purpose is serving. And I'm pretty sure, Steve, you mentioned this early in your presentation. If you're talking about a street tree that's going to be on a sidewalk between a street and a business or a building, the biodiversity there isn't quite as, don't want to say as important, but it's a smaller effort, as you say, like a yard tree or a forested area or an urban park area, which you're trying to bring in biodiversity as a whole, not just number of different species of trees. So you got to think about the site and what the needs are there and what you're trying to do behind, planting trees.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the management goals have to be defined. One place that has a native, or at least they did have a native, I don't know if they still do, is Montgomery County, Maryland. At one point had a native only ordinance. Well, it's fine for them. It's one of the wealthiest counties in the country, and the people there have all of their needs met, and their management can focus on conservation if that's what they're interested in. But in other places, without that wealth, we need trees to provide shade for people. We need shade for kids on playgrounds and shade for houses, and we need to cool urban environments for people. And in those places, the management goal is probably how can we grow the most trees and the healthiest trees to provide the services that we need in an economical, low management fashion.
Okay. So next question on the list is there information available regarding the tree condition rating that you referenced?
Yeah, so we have, let's see, where could we get that information? Because we have information on that in a couple of our publications and a couple of our extension publications. And so so that's on the extension area of the website, and if people can't find it, they can email me. But this is a pretty common metric used by arborists. It's the way that they assess the trees can be done pretty quickly by trained volunteers or arborists, and so it's constructed in a way that it's not an overly arduous process. So I can't rattle off all of the qualifications for a tree to be in one category or another right now, but it is widely used, by cities and arborists throughout the country, and so there is information on how to rate those trees, because it's all the city databases that we've used all have that rating, and they're all based on assessing canopy density, bark cracks, dead branches, and this sort of thing.
Okay. What is the basis for saying that natives are more efficient at oxygen production than exotics?
There is no basis. And so this, that first slide, those were all things that I found very quickly in a Google search of benefits for natives. And those were the sanest ones, right? People say lots of crazy stuff, but there is no basis that natives would produce more oxygen. And in fact, if it's the case that a native is in poor condition and under stress, it's going to produce less oxygen. And so, the photosynthesis that produces oxygen and also captures pollutants is a function of tree health and tree stress and the number of leaves that a tree has and these sorts of things. And so to say that native trees are endowed with some greater photosynthesis than exotic trees is crazy, because those exotic trees are native somewhere, right?
All right, let's see. Next question is, have you done any studies on street or urban trees with regards to magnitude of distress? For example, does additional soil volume help mitigate the stress and susceptibility to pests? Are the silvocil and similar technologies helpful? It's kind of multiple questions in one on that one.
That's okay, and I don't know the answer to any of them. So this is a great question, and it's not something we've been able to address. You know, we've talked to Barb Fair about this quite a bit, who I think was a previous webinar speaker. And, you know, when we're assessing these street trees, it's hard enough, but it's impossible to find trees that, you know, to add on top of the research we're doing to find trees that have low soil volume and high soil volume and things like that. It just, we can't, at this point, we haven't been able to compare soil volume specifically, except that we assess the extent of impervious surface around the trees. And so we've come up with a way that we call paste to plant, where we can very quickly measure the percent of impervious surface cover around a tree. And, you know, if that's 100%, then the tree has, it could have less soil volume, but it certainly has worse soil conditions in terms of compaction and moisture content compared to a tree that has 50% impervious surface or 10%. So I get, so you know, does increasing soil volume or silvocels reduce susceptibility? Probably. You know, if it reduces stress, it should reduce susceptibility. And so the question is, do those interventions actually reduce tree stress? I guess is where I should end that.
Yeah, and there has been research on this in some regard. I know that Barb Fair on the last webinar 2 weeks ago, she was addressing below ground and urban soil issues and how it relates to overall tree success. And she mentioned some of the research in that presentation. So if you didn't attend that webinar, you can watch the recording, or you can reach out to Dr. Fair directly and get that question, and she can direct you to the specific science behind some of that. I'm not sure it directly related to the stress, but it did talk about, or susceptibility to pests, but it did talk about the stress and more longevity and success with tree plantings in those situations. So the next question is, let's see, can you please reiterate the difference between native and wild trees?
Okay. So a native tree could be wild. Let's see. So a wild type tree is a tree that is grown from seed, from wild collected seed. And so it has a genotype that is common in the surrounding natural areas. And so you could have, you know, and that's the contrast with a cultivar tree, which is bred for a specific aesthetic or other quality. And that you would not find in the wild. You know, you can have wild type exotic trees. I think most of the exotics that we plant are also cultivars. But if you went to Asia or you went to Europe, you would find in the forests the wild type of those species that are exotic to us. And so wild type and native or exotic are not comparable language, but wild type and cultivar are the comparable types. Does that make sense?
I think so. So the next question is, have you noticed that using different terminology related to native or exotic that resonates better or worse with the audience you're working with? Kind of ties into what you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't, well, I haven't tried, I guess. You know, I think I would need a linguist or a sociologist or something to help me study that. But you know, obviously language is quite important, and the way that you call something affects people's emotional response to it, and we see that in lots of realms of life. So, you know, it could be that if exotic immediately connotes negativity, then as an industry, that terminology could be changed to I don't know what, you know, but I think there is, you know, I mean, you can look at debates about lots of things in our country today and find that use of terms that identify people or things as foreign or otherwise may have negative connotations. So maybe as an industry, we want to change that terminology so people don't have an immediate negative response, and they would have to read about the species before making a decision.
Okay, we have just like 1 more minute left. And there were 2 questions that hadn't gotten answered yet. One talked about, can you verify that exotics are better for planting in pest-prone sites?
Well, the exotics that we studied, you know, did better in pest-prone sites, and so, you know, that's what I can say. Not, you know, every species and every exotic, we couldn't study every exotic tree that's planted, but the ones that we've studied, that's the pattern that we've found, that since they have fewer pests to begin with, when you put them in pest-prone sites, they also have fewer pests.
Okay, and then the last question is talking about, asking if you can name any nurseries that have the wild type trees available in or around the Raleigh area, because they're having a hard time finding many oak species that are disappearing from their campus.
Oh geez, let's see. Memory is not my strong suit. I can't think of the ones off the top of my head. There's one in Chatham County that we use quite a bit to source these wild types. I apologize. I can't remember the name of it. If that participant would like to email me, I can look it up.
That's what I was going to say. So that was from Wendy Williams. Wendy, if you want to email Steve directly or myself, and I can forward it to Steve if you don't have his email address, then we can get that answered. So we did have someone else on the call in regards to that. There's a website that says plantant.com is a good tree finding tool, and I'll post that in the chat box for everybody. And then let's see, I'll get that in there just so everybody can have that if they want access or if they've not been to it. And another comment was that Mellow Marsh Farms in Chatham County, they should have wild types, and that might be the one you were talking about.
Yeah, that is the one we've used before.
Yeah. So that's Mellow Marsh Farms, and then there's another one that came in. It's a Cure Nursery, which is native plants. It's in Pittsburgh. So those are 2 options for you, Wendy. And we'll get there. But so in the interest of time, since we are a couple minutes over, I just want to thank everybody for coming. for attending today. You can always follow up with myself or Dr. Frank after the fact if you have some follow-up questions. I did want to mention that today's webinar was approved for the following credits. We applied for all of them and were approved for arborist, landscape contractor, and forester. I did apply for